Good afternoon, at least afternoon here in Johannesburg, and welcome to our next session of AIJC 2021, and I think we have a great session coming up. On the screen you see Aric Toler, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, from Bellingcat. I'm sure most people have heard of Bellingcat, extraordinary 10-year-old organization that has done some amazing investigations. And they've certainly spoken at our conferences before, and we've done training work with them, I must say, so they've been good partners over the years. One of their recent investigations was to hunt down the likely poisoners of the Russian dissident journalist Navalny. And so what we're going to do today is Aric is going to take us through how they did this extraordinary investigation. Aric is head of research, I believe, and training at Bellingcat, and also does his own work on some investigations, particularly in the former Soviet territories, I believe. Let me just read you Bellingcat's own description. Not Bellingcat's, but the group's founder, Eliot Higgins, put it this way. We are not exactly journalists, nor human rights activists, nor computer scientists, nor archivists, nor academic researchers, nor criminal investigators, but at the nexus of all those disciplines, he said, which I think captures quite well the fact that they're investigators and they do a bit of all sorts of things, but really hold a unique place in the investigative field. He did say its members are a loose collection of detail-oriented obsessives who spent their formative years at computers enthralled by the power of the internet. Does that sound like you, Aric?
Sounds about right, yeah. For lack of better, there's no single word, but I think they all work together.
Thank you. Aric is going to present on how they did that investigation, and one of the striking things about Bellingcat, let me say, is a commitment to transparency on how they do it, as much as they can within the limitations of what they do, but it's very striking how open they are about it and how willing they are to share it with other journalists. So Aric is going to present. If you have questions, please put them on the WOVA, or if you're in one of the venues, signal your producer, and I will cross to you when it comes to question time. Over to you, Aric.
Great. Thank you for the very kind introduction, Anton. So I'm going to be talking to you guys for 40 minutes about our investigation into the poisoning of Alexey Navalny, who, as Anton said, is the most well-known opposition figure in Russia. He's an opposition politician, he's a corruption activist, and he has a bunch of other hats he wears. He's currently in prison in Russia because he decided to return to Russia from Germany shortly after this investigation and other events. And he's in prison, well, who knows, indefinitely probably is the answer. So his term will probably be renewed as soon as he's out, but hopefully he's out sooner than later. I know that this is doing simultaneous translation into French, so I'll try to speak relatively slowly, but I can sometimes get carried away and go quickly. So I'll try to slow myself down. And I'm happy to take any questions you guys have for the last segment of this presentation. So for those who don't know, this is somebody in the lead up to this called this our paranoid board, which is a good way of putting it. It looks like a schizophrenia layout. This is for illustrative effect. This is more of a visual design artifact rather than an investigative tool, but it shows the complexity of this investigation, which I'm going to walk you guys through over the next half hour or so. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about the poisoning of Alexey Navalny. He was poisoned in August of last year by a Soviet-era biochemical weapon of Novichok. This is the same chemical weapon that was used very famously against Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury in the United Kingdom back in 2018. And this is, if you recall, this is a relatively famous incident where a couple of spies with the Russian Military Intelligence Service, or the GRU, they smeared his doorknob with this chemical agent. And thankfully, Skripal and his daughter were both injured but did not die. But unfortunately, another woman, Dawn Sturgis, did die tragically from an accident from this, kind of leftover amounts that she interacted with. So the timeline of what we're working with is Navalny. He heads up his own anti-corruption foundation, as he calls it, which is an anti-corruption investigative organization. And he and his team were traveling around Siberia in August for some work. So I'll give you the detail about what transpired before we get into how exactly we investigated this and found our leads to find out who did this poisoning. So in August 2014, and I'll have a map to go with this soon. If you don't know Russian geography, which Russia is a very, very big place, so it's very easy to get mixed up with the geography. I'll have a map for you in a minute to show you the exact movements here. But first, before we get to the map, I'll do the chronology here. So on August 14th of last year, Navalny, he arrived in Novosibirsk, which is one of the largest cities in Russia and in Siberia, from Moscow. Him and his team were there for a few days, and they drove to the Russian city of Tomsk by car. So they went from Moscow to Siberia, Novosibirsk, and they drove a few hours to Tomsk. And sometime in the evening of August 19th or the very early morning of August 20th, we don't know exactly when, Navalny was poisoned. If we now know, this is a spoiler for later on, but we now know that they smeared this bioweapon, this Novichok as it's called, into his underwear. They smeared it into like the in part of his underwear. So when he put his underwear on, it smeared on him and it absorbed into his skin from there. On the 20th, after he was poisoned, the poison at that point was working its way through his body, but he wasn't showing symptoms yet. He got on a flight from Tomsk to return back home to Moscow. And on the flight, as the flight was already in the air, as soon as it got up to taxi level, he got violently sick. He started screaming, vomiting, everything you can imagine. At this point, the pilots diverted the flight to Omsk, which is another city in Siberia. At the time, on the runway, he was immediately injected with an anti-poison bit of medicine because the paramedic who saved his life and recognized that he had been poisoned, and they gave him treatment for that. And at that point, he went to the hospital in Omsk. He was there for a few days, and eventually his wife and his team were able to get him to leave Russia and to go to Berlin, where he arrived at a hospital in Berlin, and he was treated and he recovered. So let me give you the timeline now in map form, in geographic format. So we did chronological format, and now we're going to do geographic format. So on November 14th, August 14th. Ignore the November, it should be August. He traveled from Moscow to Novosibirsk, which is quite a ways, as you see here. He then drove to Tomsk. And then while flying back to Moscow, the flight was diverted down to Omsk, and from where he was hospitalized, and then he went back to Berlin from there. Okay, so he was poisoned. That was much as clear, but everything else is a mystery. Who poisoned him? What organization poisoned him? At the time of his poisoning, it was a mystery. People thought that it could have been the Russian GRU, the military intelligence, but they often work across the border. They're equivalent to the CIA in America or the MI6. They do international operations almost exclusively. Some people thought it could be the FSB, which is the Internal Security Service. They're kind of like the American FBI, the Internal Domestic Intelligence Agency. Others thought it could be a random act, like a rogue act. So maybe Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the leader of Chechnya, who's been involved in lots of other assassinations. Maybe thought that he was, they call him the mad dog, right? He's like this kind of this crazy leader who assassinates and kills people on a whim. People thought it might have been him. And there are lots of other conspiracy theories about who exactly poisoned Navalny. So we had a few different ways to approach this question about how to do this. And we already done a lot of work on this same topic of Russian security services poisoning their opponents. With Sergei Skripal, he was a former spy. He was a double agent, or he crossed to the other side. So they poisoned him as retribution against that. So I know that we already knew about how to investigate these people who poison their opponents. And we learned from this research about how they operate, with kind of their modus operandi. The way they work is they have one or two officers who trail their target. And they often go there ahead of time. They trail them for a while. They don't just do a one-shot mission. And what they do is they arrive a day or two before the operation happens. They do the operation, right, the poisoning, and then they leave shortly after. The things that are worth noting here is they don't duplicate the itinerary of their target, right? So if they won't be on the same flight, in other words, so they try not to be on the same flight for obvious reasons, right? You don't want to be on the same flight and be spotted and recognized or whatever. They try to get there a little bit before, and they leave as soon as they can. So we thought to ourselves, okay, so if I were a Russian security officer and I were to poison Navalny, what information would I have, and which one what would I not have? They would have information about his flight itinerary, because he he bought a ticket from Moscow to Novosibirsk, then he drove to Tomsk. They probably didn't know about that, right? Because you can't buy a ticket to drive, right? You just drive. It's not like a train ticket or anything. You just get in your car and you go, and then a flight back. So they knew about his flight to Novosibirsk, and they knew about his flight from Tomsk back to Moscow. So we thought to ourselves, who had a plane ticket that had a matching itinerary to Navalny? Can we find other people outside of Navalny and his immediate team who were flying from Moscow to Novosibirsk immediately before or after him, and also from Tomsk back to Moscow? And this is a relatively unusual itinerary. Imagine somebody flying into one city and then flying out of a different city. So this is a multi-city trip. Round trips, everyone does all the time, right? You fly from Moscow to Novosibirsk, and then you have a return trip a few days later. It's normal, but it's much more unusual to have the exact itinerary of going to one city to the other, driving my car, and then returning from that third city back to the first one of Moscow. And so can we find people who had the same itinerary, but maybe not the exact same flight? Or maybe they get in earlier in the day or the day before, and maybe they leave later in the day or the day after. So how do we do this? And this is a little bit easier as well, because of Corona. This is during the height of coronavirus in August of 2020. If you remember, there's less air traffic. And so there are fewer passengers, and therefore our pool of potential candidates is much smaller. So anyone who is traveling at the same itinerary as Navalny would stick out. The reason why we can do this is because of the Russian data market. So this is relatively unique to Russia, and it's been studied intensely by journalists, human rights investigators, privacy advocates, everyone else you can say, and you can imagine. The Russian data market is very, very, very open for purchase or other ways of acquiring it. So there are bots on Telegram. like Telegram, the messaging service that where you can go in and pay a few euros, a few dollars worth of Bitcoin, and you can get any information you can imagine. If you have somebody's name or date of birth, you can then get their passport number, their phone number, their vehicle, license plate, their residence, their parking tickets, again, any information you can imagine. This is due to Russia having a relatively unique situation of almost complete surveillance of its population, like most other countries, most other large countries. The US, the UK, France, they all have almost complete surveillance of its citizens, as you can imagine. But the thing that's relatively unique about it is that this is coupled with a culture of extreme corruption, of extreme loose privacy laws, and a culture of people selling data, people who are underpaid for their jobs, and so they supplement their income by selling data. So, for example, if you're a police officer working off in the middle of nowhere in some city, the way you make extra money is often people get bribes, right? They accept bribes to supplement their income. So maybe they have a less than living wage as their salary, but then they bribe people to make up for that. Imagine here in the US, if you're a waiter or a waitress, you get paid less than minimum wage and you rely on tips to make your money. Imagine that, but for cops, right? You think your salary is low, but you get bribes to then supplement your income to make enough money to live. And another way, instead of just bribes, you can also just sell data in the data market. And there's a very large, thriving market of data where people can request information on their research target, and they can get their phone records, their travel records, their license plate, everything you can imagine. This is done very widely in Russia, and it ranges from kind of the relatively benign stuff of human resource departments. If you're hiring someone, you can run a background check on them. You can do the standard background check, but you can also just buy their personal data and see if there's anything suspicious going on. You can check their financial records, like do they have a lot of debt they're not telling you about, which makes them unreliable? Do they have a bunch of drunk driving tickets, right? Do they have, or whatever else you can imagine? Down to things that get a little bit less ethical. So, for example, you have a lot of cases of wives or husbands who suspect their partners of infidelity. And so they'll buy their phone records to see who they're texting or calling at 2:00 in the morning. Right? So instead of just going through their phone, you can spend $30 or $40 and you can buy their phone records, and then you can know if they're cheating on you or not. And this could also be done for very nefarious purposes too. You have cases of identity theft, of blackmail, and things like that, of people who use this data market for bad and not for relative good, or for, maybe if you catch your husband cheating through phone records, maybe it's a tragedy for one single person, but it's really not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. This data market is also used by journalists. This is a lot of large Russian media outlets will use this. Sometimes they say they use it, sometimes they don't say they use it, but it is used widely by journalists as well. And just a few examples of this. This is one of the officers involved in the poisoning. Again, spoiler alert, this is one of the guys named Machakov, Dmitry, who we could buy his, this is actually not even bot. This is just openly available on a Telegram bot, to where if we know his name, we can find his license plate number, which would then show us his phone numbers, his parking sessions. It shows 174 parking sessions with a certain phone number. See where he parks every day when he goes to work. This is an example of a journalist with the BBC who purchased his own and his relatives, with their permission, their records, just to judge the accuracy. And he bought his own telephone records and his, I think of his girlfriend or sister or something, I can't remember. The wife, and see all of their records, again, with her permission, to see how accurate they were, and they were accurate. Passport records, so you can see travel records as well. So when people get on flights, where they go, where they come from, their passport number, so on. And mobile telephone data. This is an example to where this is like Amazon. You can just order this, type in the number, hit add to cart, and order for 30,000 rubles, which is not all that much money. I think it's like 50 or 60 rubles per dollar or euro. You can buy someone's telephone records here. Depending on the provider, it could be easier or harder to get. So with all this in mind about how this Russian data market operates, how you can purchase for relatively cheap the personal data of a whole bunch of people, how do we find our candidates? The way we did this is by looking at or purchasing the travel manifests of the flights that arrived immediately before and immediately after Navalny. So when he arrived on August 14th. So we bought the records about the flight from Moscow to Novosibirsk on the day before he arrived, and the same thing about the day he left or the day after he left. So this again was relatively cheap. Not, it was in the hundreds of dollars, not the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we found a few people here who were especially interesting. We found 3 people who traveled together. And this is one of the crazy parts about this data is you can not just see who's on the flight, but also who are co-passengers. So for example, if you are traveling with your wife and children, you probably buy, in one transaction, you buy 4 tickets. Let's say it's you, your wife or your husband, and your son and daughter. You buy the tickets all at once in a joint operation. And then you check in together, you sit together, all that. This is the same thing for spies. They shouldn't, but thankfully they do. When they buy these tickets, or the secretary of the FSB or GRU or their travel agent or whoever, when they buy tickets for spies, they buy them in joint operations, so you can see who is traveling together. So I guess imagine a bunch of spies go to the airport and they check their luggage and go to the airport counter together before they go into the flight. And we noticed that there was only one group of people outside of Navalny and his team who had the same itinerary as him, of arriving from Moscow to Novosibirsk and returning from Tomsk to Moscow, which is a group of people named Alexey Frolov, Vladimir Panyaev, and Ivan Spiridonov. And so Frolov, Panyaev, and Spiridonov were the 3 people who purchased their tickets together doing this trip. And it's kind of unusual because I've looked at it, God knows how many of these tickets. And normally when you have these joint operations, it's usually, parents with their kids, or guys or girls with their spouses or their girlfriends or boyfriends or fiancés or whatever. Sometimes you get joint operations. When you get joint operations for a bunch of guys, usually it's either 2 brothers, or you get people who are on a business trip together, which in a way, this is a business trip. So it's relatively rare to see a bunch of people of the same sex group do these things together, because if so, it's more than often a business trip, which kind of tips us off. So this is kind of unusual. We found 3 people, 3 guys around the same age who are all co-passengers. So maybe they were, on a bachelor trip to go party together for a while. I don't know. Or maybe it's a business trip, but with the exact same itinerary as Navalny and his team. So the thing that's interesting is 2 of these people, Frolov and Spiridonov, have nothing. They have no history we could find. It's as if they were ghosts who appeared out of nowhere. So we checked. This isn't too shady. This is a very open thing in Russia. Is you can check their taxpayer number. This is similar to your social security number in the U.S., but it's less private. This is relatively public. Like you could search somebody's name and their taxpayer number will pop up. It's not really a secret bit of information. It's like someone's date of birth. It's not really a secret. And none of these people had a taxpayer number. Again, these were men in their 40s who had no taxpayer number, which meant they had never held a job or paid taxes in Russia, which is a little strange. They had no vehicles registered to them. They had no residence. They had no social media. They had no phone number. They had no address. They had nothing, which is strange for, again, 2 Russian men in their 40s going on presumably a business trip. How did they even get on this flight, right? If you don't really exist, how do you get on this flight? But one of the people did have a bit of a trail. So Spiridonov and Frolov were ghosts. It's as if they appeared for the first time in their lives on this trip, or for this and previous trips, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Panyaev, he was a real person. We looked for him, and he had a phone number, he had an address, he actually had a bit of biography to him. And we used an app called Get Contact. You may have heard of this or may have used it. It's a caller ID app. And these are applications that are very popular all over the world that when you install them on your phone, it shows you the name of somebody calling you, even if you don't know them. So if this guy were to call my phone and I don't have him in my contact book, but I have Get Contact installed, it would show one of these names for me. The way they get this information is when you install these apps on your phone, it synchronizes your contact book with the cloud. Or less generously, it steals your information, right? When you install an app and you hit accept on all the permissions, one of the accept buttons you hit is for you to have Get Contact give you or for you to give your contact book to get contact. And in somebody's contact book, they listed this guy as FSB Vladimir Alexandrovich Panyaev. And FSB, again, is the domestic security service in Russia. Now, this one data point is not conclusive proof that this guy isn't the FSB. Like, who knows? Maybe somebody was playing a joke and just put him in as their contact book. But it's a lead, right? It's something we should go off of a little bit more. We looked more into this Panyaev guy, and we pulled his full travel history, and also the travel history of Frolov. Again, the guy who outside of his travels has nothing, no footprint, no trace except for his flights. That's it. And we saw that Panyaev traveled with Frolov on previous trips. Once to Kaliningrad, Navalny was there at the same time. Once to Chelyabinsk, Navalny was there at the same time. And once to Astrakhan in April 2017, where Navalny was supposed to be, but the day before he'd been attacked with this is called Zelyonka, which is called brilliant dye. It's like a medical solution. And he had to cancel his trip the day before, but they still went, they went there looking for him or waiting for him, but he wasn't there. So this shows that the only trips that they had were ones that were related to Navalny. So like these people were ghosts who don't exist except for traveling over a 4-year period or 3-year period looking for Navalny or matching his exact trips. And we know this because Navalny, he was doing political stops because he was running for president. He was an activist at the time. So this Frolov guy, so again, he's a ghost. He only exists just to travel and following around Navalny. Who is he? So his date of birth is 16 June 1981. Let me backtrack. On a different trip that Panyaev, a trip to Omsk, where he was trailing Navalny, there's a different co-traveler that Panyaev had. And this Panyaev is a guy named Alexey Alexandrovich Alexandrov. So one of the most boring names, it's a very common name. And he was born on 16 June 1981. We looked up Alexandrov, and we found that his residence where he was living was or his former residence was right next to the FSB Academy. And we looked him up, and things looked a little more interesting when we looked into this guy. Frolov, again, who didn't exist except for these flights, his name Alexey, he was born on 16 June 1980, but Alexandrov was born with the exact same first name. The patronym or the middle name had the same first letter, and he's exactly 1 year older or 1 year younger than Frolov. So this is kind of strange that of these two co-passengers that Panyaev had, they have the exact same birthday except for 1 year. They have the same first name. And Alexandrov, by looking at his residential records, seems like he is an FSB officer because he lived at an apartment used by FSB officers when they go to the FSB Academy. But we looked more into Alexandrov, and this is the thing that kind of blew our mind. His wife's maiden name was Frolova. So what we realized is that he picked for his cover. This is a spoiler again. This is a fake identity used by Alexandrov, and he used his wife's maiden name for his fake identity, which we'll get to in a minute. So Alexandrov, at the time, if you look at Alexandrov's travel records, he was still in Moscow because he lives in Moscow. But we got his phone records because, again, you can buy people's phone records in Russia, which is crazy. And we found that Alexandrov's phone was in the same place as Navalny. Alexandrov's phone was in Novosibirsk at the same time as Navalny. And near the cell phone tower was the one closest to Navalny's hotel. So he was like outside of his hotel. And also he was in Tomsk at the same time as Navalny. So Alexandrov, according to flight records, was still in Moscow. But Frolov was not only with the exact same places, not only the exact same cities as Navalny, but he was even outside of his hotel buildings at the time. Which lets us know that Alexandrov and Frolov are the same person. Frolov is just his cover, his fake identity he uses for his missions. Alexandrov is his real name, his real identity. From there, we just do lots and lots and lots of boring work. We look at everybody that Alexandrov was traveling with, everyone that he called, everyone that he was calling around the time of the mission. So around the time of the mission, who was he calling? Who was calling him? And we just do all those numbers, all those names, all those travel records. We just kept on getting more and more and more data, which leads us to the schizophrenic paranoid board that you saw at the beginning to let us build out the entire kill team. So not only who are the FSB officers, but also who are the scientists, because this is a bioweapon. This isn't easy to use. And we realized that they were talking, the bioweapon people, who developed the Novichok, who were talking to Alexandrov and other people on the ground for the Navalny poisoning. They're the exact same people who were talking to the GRU officers before the Skripal poisoning. So Bogdanov and some of these other people that you see here, and Zhirov, who were a part of the scientists who developed the poison. In 2018, they met with and talked to the GRU officers who poisoned Sergei Skripal. And 2 years later, they were talking to the people on the ground doing the mission for the Navalny poisoning. So they are the common link to these two poisonings, one done in the UK, one done in Russia. So again, we've used all these different sources to pull together all these data sources. So we pulled the telecom data, right? So we get phone records, who called whom, and not only who called whom and when, but also it has coordinates because it shows you the nearest cell phone tower to the person when they called. The flight data, again, who traveled with whom, and we also had Navalny's travel itineraries, and so we matched up the flight histories and train histories of the FSB officers up to the Navalny. We found that they had been trailing him for years. The vehicle registration, and this is the thing that makes our life and our jobs much easier, is that many of the FSB officers, when they register their vehicles, like when they do like insurance registration or register them with the city, they put their work address for their registration. So they'll put literally the FSB headquarters as their place of residence when they register their vehicle, which seems insane. But the reason they do it is because, well, this is pretty easy when you think about it. Imagine you're a cop, you pull over a drunk driver or somebody speeding, you get his driver's license, you pull his records up, and you see that his place of residence is Lubyanka, right? The FSB headquarters. Are you giving that guy a ticket, right? Are you taking that guy to jail? You're probably letting him go, right? So this is petty corruption. This is just very simple corruption that makes it easier for the research. And it's great for us because we can find these addresses and then search the addresses and not just the names. So I'm not sure if I have these in our slides or not, but we searched the address for the operational special team of the FSB, which is kind of out in the suburbs in Moscow, in the middle of nowhere. And we searched every single car registered to that address. No one lives there, right? It's just the work address. We found there were about 200, I think, people registered with this address. And of them, I think 90% of them were men, and they were all between the ages of like 24 and 55, which when you think about an FSB officer, that's exactly who you would imagine it being, a male between 24, 25, and 50, 55. And also predictable algorithms, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. So this data point doesn't just give us only the FSB officers involved in Navalny poisoning. It gives a list of literally hundreds of FSB officers because of all these very simple mistakes these people were doing. They're registering their cars to their workplace. They were using their real phone numbers to call each other, right? Because you can get that telecom data. And they were flying in joint operations. They're booking the same tickets at the same time as their colleagues to go on work trips, which is all accessible through a $40 database that you can buy. And again, we can reconstruct not only the events, but also the hierarchy. Who is in charge of whom? So you can tell by the order people call in. So somebody on the ground calls their boss, who then calls their boss, who calls their boss, and they report back down. It's like a ladder that goes up and a ladder that goes down. And from that, we can figure out the hierarchy of the team. So this is an example of what the data looks like. A big, ugly bit of numbers and dates and coordinates. And then we put all this down in tens of thousands of rows on Google Docs. You can see right here, this is a sample version. These are rows 1,200 of just this one data. We have more data you can imagine with this. And of course, the telecom data is, you can cross-reference that with other databases and other sources. So when you register your vehicle, you put your phone number with that. So we search that phone number, we find your address, we find your passport number, and we search that address and passport number with other data points to really build out what's going on. So using all this data, one of the endpoints of this is we found of 36 trips of these FSB operatives that matched exactly with that of Navalny, meaning they traveled together in groups of 2 and 3 to shadow Navalny on his work trips. And these trips weren't just Moscow, Petersburg, the big cities. They were Moscow to Vladivostok, which is next to Japan. They were to relatively small cities in Siberia in the middle of absolutely nowhere, places where no one would go on purpose, right? Because they're kind of mosquitoes and cold and everything else you can imagine. So they weren't just going to Petersburg and Sochi to relax or whatever. They were going to small cities in the middle of nowhere. They were going all the way down to the Pacific Ocean. These were clearly intentional trips to follow and trail Navalny. So here's an example of a few of these trips with all these different officers who are researching about all the trips they were going to Moscow, to Novosibirsk and Samara and Penza and other places, including the multi-trip. So there were 3 cities, like Navalny, remember the original, he went from Moscow to Novosibirsk to Tomsk, and some of those 3 city legs were also reconstructed in here as well. So this is, at this point, it's a statistical impossibility that this was on accident, because these were very obscure trips, sometimes with 3 cities in one trip and not just one round trip. And this specifically is for the trips around the poisoning that happened in Siberia, to where this team, they followed him to Omsk, they followed him to Novosibirsk and then Tomsk, and then some of them even went to follow him at the hospital in Omsk too. So they were actually at the hospital with him in Omsk too. So they followed him even to the hospital, because they tried to kill him. They almost did. The reason why he survived is because the pilot, 2 reasons. The pilot decided to reroute the plane and not just keep flying, but to reroute it and immediately land in the nearest city. And on the tarmac, the paramedics gave him a life-saving injection. If either of those things did not happen, then he would be dead. And also vehicle registration, which I mentioned earlier, the Special Center for Operations in a Moscow suburb. All these people were kind enough to register their vehicles to this address for us. And parking data too, because I don't know why, but for some reason in Moscow, parking data is public information. If you have someone's phone number or license plate, you can find out where they park, because this is with your phone. It's like an app on your phone, and it links your phone number to your license plate. So when you go and you park, you go and you plug money from your credit card into the app to park. And if if the money runs out, you get a ticket or a towed or whatever. And this is how, I don't know why, but for some reason, this is public information you can access. You can reference up the phone number or to license plate. And these people would park at the FSB office every day, which made it easy to track. And you can see this person right here, 368 parking sessions. You can see exactly where, how long, when, how much it cost them, the license plate, everything else. And again, here's an example of one of these people who was registered, one of the people who was parked outside the FSB every day, who was called frequently during this operation. He put his registered address to the military unit that is involved in the development of chemical weapons out in Moscow. So this made our work, again, relatively easy, because this is all public information once we search for it. And the fake passport thing, we can then predict and find new people who aren't in the flights and aren't in the phone calls, because we can predict their algorithm for creating fake identities. So if you're a spy, you get a fake name, you get a fake passport. How do we connect the real human who is born and dies with an identity, and the fake passport that is born, after you're 45 years old and then maybe dies 5 years later? So like I said earlier, with Alexandrov, it's Frolov, it's the same first name. The date of birth is the exact same, except either 1 year or 6 months different. Spiridonov, who is one of the 3 people who trailed Navalny that we found in the first place. The guy's real name is Asipov. And the first name is the same. The date of birth is 1 year off, and the patronym in the middle, the same first letter. And again, this guy is Konstantin Kudratsev and Sokolov, and again, same thing. Date of birth, the same first name, date of birth 1 year off, and the last name is his wife's maiden name. Keep the first name, the patronym is usually the same or the first initial. The last name is either their wife or girlfriend's maiden name. Date and month are the same. Subtract 1 year. Ta-da, fake identity. And this eventually culminated in Navalny calling one of his poisoners. So Konstantin Kudryavtsev, who is what you can see here, he's on the bottom right, the second from the left on the bottom right, Konstantin Kudryavtsev, the guy kind of a dopey look on his face. Navalny called him. And because this is kind of like a right of reply, I guess, as a journalist. And the thing about this is we knew everything about this poisoning operation. We knew everyone who's involved. We know who called whom, who's in charge of whom, who traveled with whom. We knew everything because we had everyone's phone records, their travel records. We knew more about this operation than some of these people knew about it. And so what Navalny did is he spoofed his number to make it look like his phone was coming from the operational center of the FSB, because we knew this phone number because they called it. So we spoofed our phone number to make it look like it was call was coming from the FSB. And Navalny himself called Kudryavtsev, and Kudryavtsev answered. It's 7 a.m. for him, very early, and he's coughing. He has COVID too, so he's tired. He has COVID. He's recovering. He's a mess at this point. And Navalny pretended to be like the boss of his boss of his boss. So like he pretended to be like a boss, like 4 or 5 steps up from him, like, just a few steps down from, Putin or the head of the FSB. And this is, if you haven't listened to this, I'd recommend, even if you don't know Russia, it's worth listening, because Navalny more or less bullies him into giving up every detail of the operation that he can. He says, hello, I'm so-and-so, I'm so-and-so's boss. I'm doing a report about this poisoning and why it went wrong, why Navalny survived. And Kudryavtsev doesn't recognize Navalny's voice. And Navalny, he's mean to him. Like, he bullies him into, I need to get this out right away. Do you want me to tell your boss that you impeded this investigation? Do you really want to be the one, you already failed killing Navalny. Do you also want to get in trouble for me not getting this report done on time? He was mean to him. And he, over a 43-minute phone call, gets Kudryavtsev he walks him through every step of the investigation of the poisoning. He says, so-and-so, how would you grade the performance of your colleague Panyaev? And he says, okay, 5 out of 5. Okay, he was good. He's like, well, why did it fail then? And then he kind of grills him and interrogates him about, like, you said all your colleagues did well, but then why is Navalny still alive? And so this is just one of the craziest things you'll ever listen to about a guy who is while pretending to be his boss, he's interrogating his would-be murderer. Again, it's insane if you listen to it. And that's kind of the culmination of the investigation. Is we did all this work with our paranoid schizophrenia board, like it's at a Homeland or something like that. And from this, we knew every detail of the operation. And then, armed with these details, again, before we published anything, obviously, with months and months after the assassination attempt, Navalny calls his own poisoners. He runs through every detail of it, and he finds out, how the poison was applied, what the operation was, who was in charge of whom, and so on. So that's I'm going to wrap this up and leave this to Anton. So we have another 20 minutes or so for questions and other things. But I'll wrap it up with that. And I'll go back to the very beginning, and I'll put the original board up here so you can see the beauty of the original cork board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aric. Thank you. That really is quite an extraordinary bit of investigative work, I must say. I want to start with a question, if I may. And it's something you talked about, but I think is worth just talking a little more, because, the description of you guys between investigators and journalists, I want to ask you, and clearly I get what you say, that a lot of the what we would consider private data is not freely, but relatively easily available in Russia. Do you have a set of rules? Do you follow a journalistic set of ethics, an investigative set of ethics, your own set of ethics, no set of ethics? What are the rules for you about that kind of data?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we also, I didn't mention this, but we cooperated with a handful of other more traditional investigative outlets with this investigation. CNN, for example, they actually went and knocked on the door of one of these guys. I think it was Kudratov. They actually like knocked on his door to try to get him out, in Moscow, and also Der Spiegel in Germany and The Insider in Russia, who face great harm and danger in Russia in particular. So we had that helping us too. We weren't completely going solo with this, but the way we handle this data is we try to do research with what we have to, and then try to cut out the extraneous stuff. So when we do these investigations, we think that the operatives themselves, the actual FSB operatives or GRU spies, they're fair game. Their information, we don't publish their full. We don't publish their phone numbers. I mean, it's not hard to find. You could reconstruct our methods very easily and figure this out. We don't publish their actual real home address. We don't publish their actual phone number, though, of course, as I said, you could easily reconstruct our process. And we try to exclude anything about their spouses and children and stuff as well. And when we look at flight data, obviously, we don't put anything out there about any civilians, right? Any passengers who are civilians and have nothing to do with GRU and FSB. And even within the GRU and FSB, even then we have a lot of restraint. For example, I mentioned earlier about all these people registered their cars to their work. And there's the GRU, that's the FSB. For the GRU, we found the exact same thing with, I think, 300, cars registered, which means 300 GRU officers. We've not published any of this. Like, we only publish about people who we know were involved in specific operations that were led to assassinations, violence, whatever. We could theoretically, if we wanted, we can just publish like a list of almost every FSB or GRU officer that we know of, which is a lot of them, like not all of them, but maybe a majority, maybe not of them. But we're not a hostile intelligence service. We aren't a fan of the FSB or the GRU, but we're not an intelligence service. We're not out here just to destroy Russia or its security services. We're here to publish data very narrowly about specific operations that led to violence or to deter future violence from these same assassins who used, again, a chemical weapon in the UK and Russia, and from a different investigation also in Bulgaria to kill their opponents. So to answer your question, we try to, when we publish data, we try to narrowly keep it to not just FSB and GRU officers, but the ones who are specifically involved in these operations. Though when we acquire data, it's impossible not to have extraneous data, because when we buy someone's flight records, well, it's not just them, it's all their passengers. And when they get their phone records, it's not just them, it's also the people they call who are not spies or operatives. So we try not to publish any of that. We try to keep that not public as much as we can. And we try to, when we publish stuff, try to be as responsible and narrow as we can, but also keep as much transparency as possible with the data points that actually matter.
Extremely interesting. Any rules about paying, what did you call them, tips? Bribes for information?
So when we work the data market, it is inevitable that you do have to spend money. So this is definitely what keeps us different from a traditional journalistic outlet, because I know the New York Times and the BBC, they wouldn't allow their journalists to pay for data in the same way. So yes, that definitely makes us different than a traditional quote unquote journalistic outlet, because we have paid for data, and it's most often going through these literally bots or these other services. Sometimes you have to work a little bit closer with sources, but almost always what we're doing is we're working through either a third-party bot or non-personal resource, because we don't, very rarely will we actually be in contact with the people fetching the data. It's almost always through the middleman. Just like if you buy something from Amazon, you're not talking to the person going to load stuff into the truck, you're talking to the merchant service. And it works similar with data market data. But that said, there have been, the data market has significantly changed since this investigation. It's much harder now to get this information, and Russia has really cracked down on this stuff. think we finally scared them into actually having data privacy in their country a little bit. So yeah, we do pay. We have paid for data, though more often than not, the way this actually looks in reality is like me sending, $20 of Bitcoin to a Telegram bot is how this actually looks more often than not.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Here in Joburg, I've got a question. So we're going to just cross over to Isak to ask a question.
Thank you. Earlier today, we had an interesting session on doing investigations, journalism investigations that can stand up in court. There's also been recently, and I think Bellingcat participated in some of the academic processes, to look at setting standards for OSINT investigations. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, but also then, to what extent, what is Bellingcat's policy about working with police and prosecution authorities, sharing information, not sharing information? Would you, for instance, do an investigation in a way that you can provide them with the evidence to proceed with prosecution? Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good set of questions. So I'll go through them as thoroughly, but also briefly as I can, so we have time for other questions. So there's a couple of different approaches to, we call it justice and accountability, right? With using open source and other standards for things like international criminal court cases and so on. So we were involved in a mock trial. If you, I'll look for a link for it. I can send it on. But we were involved in a mock trial recently in the UK that tried to assess how open source evidence could be used in a criminal court proceeding, something like the UN or the International Criminal Court or elsewhere. When, for example, a photo or video maybe portrays a crime against humanity, how could that video or photo from YouTube or Facebook be used, if at all, in a court case? And there's a lot of people doing a lot of great work with this. The University of California at Berkeley, for example, is doing a lot of the leading work with this, and a lot of other places as well. It's not just them, not just us. And this is something that the international bodies, the UN, IIIM, and others are working on to try to figure out standards for archiving data, retaining data, verifying data, and necessary metadata and other considerations. So that's for the very, very broad stuff, right? So you show a video of a bombing in Yemen or Syria, how could that footage be used in a criminal court? That's kind of it's a very lawyerly thing of looking at standards of evidence and what stands up to the court. As for, there's other cases as well. So I think one thing to keep an eye on is very, very soon, we hope there'll be a verdict passed in Berlin about a case, a different case we worked on around the assassination of a Chechen dissident in Berlin. A man working for the FSB and just in broad daylight walked up and shot this Chechen in Berlin, and then he got caught. And we've done a lot of work on this, and the evidence that we dug up on this guy, the assassin, is basically the same as what you're seeing in the Navalny case. A lot of the same sources and methodologies, and much of this evidence was the evidence used to connect him to the state, to the Russian state. So the verdict is coming down soon. I think all the proceedings are done except for just the verdict. So keep an eye on that and what the verdict is announced. If it's guilty and that evidence was used in that decision, then that's a landmark case about using this sort of data in court cases. So, but if it's rejected, then maybe, back to the drawing board. I'm not sure. So keep an eye on that. And as for the other question, I'm sorry, what was the final question? Oh yeah, police, we're working with police. So with that, we try to restrict it to extreme cases or when there's an open call for help. So example, the places we've worked with the most probably, or it's mostly been one way, is the Joint Investigation Team, the Dutch-led criminal investigation into the downing of MH17, which was the Malaysian airliner that was shot down over Eastern Ukraine in 2014. They have frequent calls for assistance, and we have submitted quite a bit of our work to them as part of their public calls for help, calls for assistance, because this is such an important case, and 298 people died in the shoot down. And we will often send, we may have our report we publish on our site, but we may send the unredacted full version to them ahead of time. So stuff that, we may blur lots and lots of personal information in a report, but we'll send them the unredacted full version because coming as part of their call for assistance. So we've submitted stuff before when they are part of things like calls for assistance. And we also, in the case of the Berlin assassination, my colleague Christo, who's done the most of work on this, he's given evidence to the prosecutors. He was a witness, right? He was called a witness because a lot of the work we've done on we were the first people to identify him, and so he was called as like a key witness as part of this, as part of the court proceedings. So even if we wanted to, we probably couldn't avoid cooperating there because he would be called. He would get harassed and called as a witness until he showed up to the court in Germany. So we try to not work too much with unsolicited help. Like we don't, just randomly send police on all the work we do, unless there's like a very clear, immediate danger. There's a threat, something like that. But outside of that, we mostly work with public calls for assistance, like with the joint investigation team into the MH17 downing.
Assistance. And if I'm a journalist somewhere on this continent and I'm investigating an incident that is this kind of incident, are you open? I'm asking, I suppose, this on behalf of the people in our audience on there. Are you open to approaches to assist and with some of those skills for journalists working on relevant public interest stories?
Yeah, sure. And we also have, just to give a plug, my colleague Yuri is doing a presentation tomorrow along with how some of these investigative techniques have been used in a case in Cameroon and one in the Tigray region as well. But yeah, we run these workshops both free and for money, depending on the size of the organization, the type of training. And we do take contributions and calls for help and stuff like that. We're a relatively small team. We have about 20 or so people on staff. We're not giant at all. But yeah, we do often cooperate with other journalists for investigations, and we also have a lot of resources for free on our site. If you just go to bellingcat.com and hit guides, we have tons and tons of resources, including more in the Navalny case, if you're interested, to help people learn different investigative techniques. And we also have a toolkit, bit.ly/bcat tools. I can put a link to it in the chat in a little bit, to where we have a free toolkit. It goes pages and pages and pages of different free, often free resources that you can use for different, image verification, tracking airplanes, researching photos on Instagram, whatever it is you're into. So we have lots of different avenues for that.
Thank you. And this is a good moment then to plug that you've got a masterclass tomorrow, 2:45 Johannesburg time, yes. Which Yuri is doing, and I would urge people to attend that masterclass. I've attended one or two before, and they really are very useful. One picks up fantastic skills. So make a note of that. Let me ask you, and I mean, you've touched on this as well, your own security as individuals and as a team. I mean, you must have had to take some special measures to protect yourselves and your data and so on.
Yeah, we've been, in particular, we've been targeted by the Russian security services with cyber attacks a few times. Way back, I can't even tell you how many times my inbox has been hit with phishing attacks. Knock on wood, I don't think we have had any real actual leaks or dangers yet. But of course, it's always something that could happen. As far as physical security goes, I personally am not worried at all because I'm sitting here in the U.S. But my colleague Christo, he's under a lot more threat because he travels all over, and he has made a lot of enemies of a lot of people with a lot of money and not a lot of morals. But more than anything, I can complain and whine about inconvenience to me about having to have extra security on my inboxes and devices, but our colleagues in Russia face infinitely more, both physical and cyber threats than we do. Our investigative colleague on this report, Roman Dobrahotov, he had to flee Russia because he had a trumped up case that the GRU or FSB assisted on, and he's had to flee the country in Russia. He's now kind of a nomad moving around Europe. And he had to leave his wife and kids behind in Russia because he had to flee. He crossed the border. after they confiscated his passport and documents. So again, the threat that I get, I can kind of moan and complain about, I have to put extra 2-factor or 3-factor security on my inboxes and whatever. But the threat to our colleagues in Russia is, infinitely more, exponentially more, both for physical danger, legal danger, financial danger, and of course the cyber attacks too.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to wrap up. Thank you so much for the generosity with which you share the work you do and how you do it.
Sure.
The session tomorrow will add to that. This evening in our conference, in 15 minutes, we have the Africa Check Fact-Checking Awards. And thereafter, we have the Carlos Cardoso Memorial Lecture, with the focus on Eritrea. So I think we're in for a full evening, and then hopefully a dinner where we can all chat and network, certainly here in Johannesburg and hopefully in the other cities as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. It's been a fascinating session. See you a little bit later.